So welcome to the webinar again. My name is Ronja Bechelf. I'm a policy analyst with the International Institute for Sustainable Development. I work on green public procurement and on sustainable infrastructure. So in the webinar today, we will focus on a case study of nature-based infrastructure, more specifically forest restoration in Indonesia. And we will learn about the methodologies we can use to value the benefits from nature-based infrastructure and how to develop an integrated cost-benefit analysis. Let me briefly go over some housekeeping rules today because we're quite a few people. So please keep your microphone on mute. You're of course welcome to have your video on if you like. If you have a question, please ask in the chat. My colleagues Emma, Eduardo, and Georg will try to already respond to your questions in the chat, or we will pick them up in the questions and answers session at the end of the webinar. And we're already recording the session and share the recording and the presentation with you afterwards. So just a few words about why we're organizing a webinar like this today. As you see on this slide, this is already the third deep dive webinar that we're having this year. And this is because a lot of participants from our previous training course were asking about more case studies and more in-depth explanations about the methodologies, how to value nature-based infrastructure. So we're organizing these webinars about projects we have worked on. You can find recordings of the first two sessions online. And as I just said, we will also share this one with you. So today we will focus on the case study from Indonesia about forest restoration. My colleague Emma Cutler will take about 30 minutes to explain the methodology to you and the results. Emma is a system dynamics analyst with our infrastructure team at ISD, so she's really one of our experts in modeling approaches for understanding nature-based infrastructure, and she will share her first-hand experience with you. And then in the second part of the webinar, we will hear from a project stakeholder about how results of such an integrated assessment, such an integrated cost-benefit analysis can be used on the ground. And then in the end, I hope we will have plenty of time for questions and answers. So we would like to make this as interactive as possible. Feel free to ask all the questions you might have. And we will also make this quite focused on the methodology. We have a more introductory course about nature-based infrastructure and climate adaptation. So this one is really to dive into the methods and the nitty-gritty questions that people on the ground might have. So with that, I would hand it over to my colleague Emma for presenting the case study from Indonesia. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ronja. So as Ronja mentioned, I'm going to be presenting a case study. And this is a case study using what we call our Sustainable Asset Valuation, or SAVi methodology. And on this slide, just to kind of read out what SAVi is, this is a methodology that quantifies and values the environmental, social, and economic risks and externalities of infrastructure projects. And this methodology has been developed by the infrastructure and finance team at IISD, is based on systems thinking and system dynamics, which are some tools for modeling, as well as spatial models and financial models. Each of our assessments is customized to the individual project that we're assessing, and also co-created with stakeholders. So as Ronja mentioned, we do have a guest speaker today who will be able to provide some more context on our assessment that we're talking about. We use climate data, which I'll be touching on very briefly in a few moments, about how we can actually incorporate climate data into these assessments. And then also kind of how all of these different modeling approaches work together to present a holistic view of the value of nature-based infrastructure. So for our case study today, I'm going to be presenting an assessment of forest restoration for water resources management in Indonesia. And I think, Eduardo, if you could share the link to the report. If you would like to check out the report later, you're more than welcome to do that. So today, I'm going to start by just giving a little bit of background on this project and presenting some of our key results and findings. And then I'm going to go into some more details about how we actually calculated some of the benefits that we included in the assessment. So to begin with, just some background about this project. This is an area located on the island of Java, specifically in the province of East Java in Indonesia. And we were focusing on 3 sub-watersheds in the upper Brantas River basin. So this outline here is our study area. This is a relatively mountainous area with a lot of agriculture and forest. And it's located upstream from the city of Surabaya, which is a fairly large city that also has a lot of industrial activity, including a Heineken brewery. So water management is very important in this area. But this location has been experiencing a fair bit of environmental challenges in recent years. So specifically, agriculture has been expanding, which has led to deforestation and land degradation. And what this means is that the land is not able to hold on to as much water when it rains. So it leads to droughts during the dry season, but it also leads to flooding and erosion during the rainy season. And these impacts, the drought, the flooding, and the erosion, affect both the agriculture in that upstream area, as well as the industry in the downstream urban area. And then with agriculture, there's also an increase in water pollution as nutrients are running off into the water sources. Looking to the future, many of these challenges are projected to continue. So we expect that there may be more land degradation as population continues to grow and agriculture expands. There will be increased water demand, which will exacerbate droughts. And thinking about climate change, this is an area that's expected to get more precipitation in the future and also expected to have more variability in that precipitation. So this means that both flooding could get worse and water scarcity could get worse. In response, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, or UNIDO, brought together a group of public and private stakeholders to identify priority actions to address the water management challenges in this watershed, and then to apply for funding from the Global Environment Facility to address these concerns. And later, we will hear from Christian Zuzan from UNIDO about some of this work and how UNIDO was able to use the results of this assessment. Moving on to give a little bit of overview about the project. Specifically, there's 2 broad interventions that we were assessing. The first was focused on land restoration. And specifically, this included reforestation and improved management of about 3,700 hectares. And in addition to kind of reforesting this area, this would also help to prevent future deforestation. And as part of this restoration, there was tree planting and also the establishment of bamboo plantations, as well as agroforestry systems. And so the outcomes of this work include removing nutrients, which will improve water quality, retaining sediment and mitigating erosion, sequestering carbon, providing income from agroforestry and bamboo production, and then helping to retain water, which will improve water availability and also mitigate flooding. And thinking a little bit more about this water management, the second piece of the project really focused exclusively on this water resource management. And this included building or sort of constructing 2 different types of retention wells. And these are essentially just holes that are dug in the ground. So the first type are called what we call absorption wells. These are a little bit larger. They're about 2 meters across and 2 meters deep. And the second type are much smaller. They're called biopori. These are about 10 centimeters across and 1 meter deep. And again, these are really just these sort of holes and wells in the ground that can help to retain water, which will increase groundwater recharge and also mitigate flooding. For our SAVi assessment, we had a few different objectives. First, we wanted to quantify the costs and benefits of this forest restoration and water management project. Second, we wanted to think about how this upstream reforestation could affect downstream water availability. And for this project, we're focusing actually on a very small area. This is really more of a pilot project. And so just this project in isolation would be very unlikely to have a large-scale impact on the downstream area. But we can think about, if this project were scaled up to a much larger area, then what would be the impact downstream? And because we're so interested in this idea of scaling up, we also wanted to try to identify mechanisms to fund this reforestation and improve water management. So for our assessment, we used a few different modeling approaches. First, we created something called a causal loop diagram. And I know some of you have been in our presentations before and are familiar with this. If you're not familiar with the causal loop diagram, all it is a diagram that shows different pieces of the social and environmental system. So it brings in an aspect related to humans, the environment, the economy, and shows how all of these different variables interact with each other and can help to explain past changes that have been observed, as well as helping to understand how interventions might play out when they're implemented. The second piece of the assessment used spatial models. And specifically, we use what's called the Integrated Valuation of Ecosystem Services and Trade-offs, or INVEST models. And this is a suite of models that quantifies ecosystem services based on the land cover. The next piece of the assessment brought in climate data. So we use data from the Copernicus Climate Data Store. Specifically for this assessment, we use precipitation projections, which I'll be showing a little bit later in the presentation. And this allows us to start to understand the climate adaptation benefits of this project. The next step in the process was to bring together this understanding of the system that we get from the causal loop diagram, combine that with the outputs of the spatial analysis, and then bringing in all of this climate information, we put it all into a spreadsheet model. And this is where we can actually calculate the costs, added benefits, and avoided costs of this project. And this forms the basis for our integrated cost benefit analysis. And then finally, we bring in a discount rate so we can discount the future costs and benefits, and we do a time-based analysis, which allows us to calculate indicators that are relevant to investors, including things like the net present value and the internal rate of return. So for today, I'm going to be focusing primarily on our integrated cost benefit analysis, or CBA. And specifically, the indicators that we included in this CBA first include the direct costs. So this would be the costs associated with improving land management and reforestation, building those absorption wells and biopori, and then we also need to consider the annual maintenance costs. We can then turn our attention to the added benefits. So for this project, we want to consider the value of the bamboo production from bamboo plantations, the value of agroforestry, so this is the sort of income that farmers could earn by establishing these agroforestry systems, wages that the local community could earn by being engaged in the tree planting activities, and then also carbon that will be stored in the reforested area. But we also want to think about the costs that can be avoided by implementing this project. So specifically, we think about the avoided costs of flooding. So we're calculating flood damages avoided to households and agriculture. We also calculated the avoided costs of erosion damage and the avoided costs of water pollution. So here, I just want to take a moment and give you a chance to reflect. And based on your experience with nature-based infrastructure and reforestation projects, think for a moment about which of these benefits and avoided costs do you think would be the largest? So we're reforesting a large area, we're bringing in this improved water management, and if you'd like to, you're welcome to put what you think would be the largest benefits and avoided costs in the chat, or you can just think about it quietly for a few minutes. Okay, so moving on, I am going to show the results of our cost-benefit analysis. And here you can see I've highlighted in purple the largest benefits. So first, up here we have carbon storage. And what we see is that the value of carbon storage is almost $32 million. And comparing that to our investment and maintenance costs down here, the total costs are about $10 million. So the carbon storage on its own provides much more value than the costs that are required to implement this project. So that really highlights the value of the carbon storage. But we also see that the avoided flood damages and the avoided erosion damages are very large. And this helps to bring out and highlight the fact that this really does contribute to climate adaptation. And so this project is able to avoid a lot of those damages that would be associated with climate impacts in this area. And to summarize our key results, first, we see that the project delivers net benefits. And specifically, if we look at all of the added benefits and all of the avoided costs and divide that by the investment and maintenance costs, what we find is that the benefit to cost ratio is over 10. And so what that means is that for every dollar that's invested in the project, there's more than $10 worth of value that's created. So this really just highlights how much value this type of project can create. The second thing that we see is that the carbon storage benefit on its own is larger than those project costs. And the reason that this is important is that what this means that if we're able to actually monetize that carbon storage benefit, then that could be a viable way to finance this project. And then finally, this project increases the climate resilience of the area. So we saw that those avoided flood and erosion damages were some of the largest benefits created by this project. We also were able to show that those avoided costs increase as the risks of those damages increase. So as the risk of flooding becomes worse and there's more potential flooding in the future, the value of that avoided flood damages becomes larger. So this really helps to highlight how important these projects are for climate adaptation. But we also care about the water scarcity issue. And what we do see with this project is that the water retention increases, and this can help to mitigate some of the drought problems in this area. So specifically, thinking about how this type of upstream reforestation can improve water resource management in the downstream. First, we have to understand that climate change is making droughts and floods worse. So right now, during the dry season, in the upstream area, surface water availability is no longer able to meet all of the demand. And so what this means is that groundwater is becoming a more important source of water in the upstream area. And by extracting more groundwater upstream, this means that droughts downstream could get worse. But we do see that this project increases water retention. Specifically, just looking at the impact of adding more trees, that change in land cover can increase water retention by up to about 6%. And then when we include the impact of those water retention wells and the biopori, that water retention increases even more. And so this reduces the surface water runoff and also enhances groundwater recharge, which will increase water availability. As I mentioned, though, this is a relatively small scale project. So just this one pilot would not be expected to have a noticeable impact downstream. But if we could scale these types of interventions up, there could be some very large benefits for individuals and businesses in that downstream urban environment. So moving on, I'm now going to go into a little bit more detail about how we calculated a couple of those indicators. And specifically, I'm going to focus on the avoided flood damages and the carbon storage. So first, thinking about the avoided flood damages. To estimate how much damage this project can avoid, we start with precipitation. And once we have an estimate for precipitation, we want to know how much area will actually be inundated. And we were able to find a study that was completed in 2019 for the Brantas River Basin. And what this study told us was that it basically gave us a table that said for some amount of precipitation, this is how much area will be inundated in our study area. And so once we know how much area will actually be flooded, we need to make an estimate for how many households will be damaged. And to do that, we use the average number of households per hectare in the study area. So we start with data that tells us how much area is inundated for a given depth of precipitation. And then if we know how many households are in that area, we can estimate how many households are flooded for that precipitation depth. And what this means is that we can actually establish a mathematical relationship between the precipitation depth and the number of households damaged. And I'm going to show this relationship on the next slide. So here, this graph is just showing kind of how much rainfall might occur in a specific precipitation event. So you can think about this as how much rain there will be in one day, and then how many households are inundated for that amount of rainfall. And what you might notice here is that this means that if we have an estimate for how much rain there is, we can estimate how many households are damaged. But that means we actually need a projection for the precipitation. And this is where the climate data comes in. So here I'm going to show the rainfall projections that we used for this assessment. We considered two different climate scenarios. So this first one up here is RCP 4.5, and we assume that that's sort of a low climate change scenario. Down here we show RCP 8.5, which we take to be a high climate change scenario. And on both of these graphs, the first few years shown in orange are historical observations. And then right here around the year 2020, we switch over to projections. So on this graph, you can see I've drawn a line across at about 600 millimeters of rain each month. And under RCP 8.5, what you'll notice is that the monthly precipitation goes above that 600 millimeter line quite frequently. And so this just tells us that we might expect to see a lot more flooding under RCP 8.5. But of course, with our lower climate change scenario, there's also a lot of flooding. Specifically, we see here, there's a huge flooding event. So what this tells us is that regardless of kind of which climate scenario we're looking at, there will be more flooding in this location. So we're able to start with precipitation. We go to the area that's flooded. We can then estimate the number of households that are damaged. But we actually want to be able to put a monetary value on that damage. So we want to estimate the total damage to all of those households. And we do that using some data that we found in the peer-reviewed literature, which was a survey done in Indonesia that calculated an average flood damage per household that was flooded during a range of different events. So by knowing the number of households damaged and the average damage per household, we can then estimate the total damage to the two households. But we don't necessarily just want to know how much damage there will be. We want to know how much damage can be avoided. And to do that, we need to understand how this project can actually change the flood exposure of this area. And we do this using our spatial models. So we actually simulate the change in runoff when this project is implemented. And we do this using a hydraulic model. So we start with a land cover map, which is shown right here. This is just a small subset of the project area. But what we do is we start with this land cover map. And then we assume that these biopori and retention wells are built on the landscape. And those are all of those small little dots that you see in the green area. And from that, we can then run our hydraulic model, both with those retention wells and without. And when we do that, we find that the surface water runoff is reduced by about 33% when the retention wells are built. And so as just kind of a first estimate for the avoided flood damages, we assume that there's about a 33% reduction in damages. Of course, this is a huge assumption. We don't necessarily know that the reduction in runoff retention will be the same as the reduction in flood damages, but it's kind of a first estimate so that we can start to think about how much flood damage actually can be avoided by this project. So just to summarize, we start with the precipitation. We use an existing engineering study to then estimate the area that's inundated. Based on the number of households per hectare, we can convert that to the number of households that are damaged. By knowing the damage per household, we know how much damage total would occur without the project. And then based on the results of this hydraulic model, we can estimate how much of that damage would be avoided by the project. So now, moving on, I'm going to go into how we actually calculated the carbon storage benefit. But carbon storage is a little bit different from flood damages. And one of the big differences is that when we think about flood damages, it's not too hard to kind of make the jump to how that really has an economic impact. So it's very common for people to put a monetary value on the amount of damage that a flood causes, whether that's the value of the assets that are damaged, the value or the amount of money that would be required to rebuild. But carbon storage is a little bit different because we don't typically think of carbon as a market commodity that's bought and sold. And so this raises the question of how can we actually monetize carbon storage? And there are a few different ways we can do this. So we could think about the social cost of carbon, which is an economic estimate for how much damage will be done to the global economy for each ton of carbon dioxide that's emitted. We could think about a carbon tax that businesses or individuals might have to pay for actually emitting carbon dioxide. Or we can think about carbon credits and the voluntary carbon market, which is essentially where one entity will pay another to reduce their emissions. And that was what we used for this assessment. And so to do this, we start with two land cover maps. The first is our business as usual land cover, where we assume that deforestation will continue. And the second is our reforested land cover. And using those two different land cover maps, we can calculate the amount of carbon that is stored in the landscape for each scenario using our spatial models, which are, we use the INVEST models, which is a suite of models that allows us to quantify ecosystem services based on land cover. And then once we know the carbon that's stored under our reforestation scenario and the carbon that's stored under the business as usual scenario, we can calculate the change in carbon storage simply by subtracting them. So to show how this works, we start with our two land cover maps. So over here on the left is business as usual. And what you'll notice is that in this region right here, there's a lot of yellow. And that yellow represents agricultural expansion. But over here in the reforestation scenario, you'll notice that in the same area, there's a lot more green. And that's showing that forest is being restored and deforestation is being prevented. So we can then put each of these land cover maps into that INVEST model to actually quantify how much carbon is being stored in this land cover. And here I'm going to show the results of that model. So this is again showing business as usual and reforestation. And these maps, the darker areas correspond to locations that have more carbon being stored in the landscape. So we'll notice over here, looking at that same small region and business as usual, it's much lighter than in the reforestation, which shows us that carbon is being sequestered by this project. And specifically, the reforestation increases carbon storage by 2.64 million tons of carbon. If we convert that to carbon dioxide emissions, this comes out to about 9.7 million tons of carbon dioxide. So now that we know what the change in carbon storage is, we have to actually value that carbon storage. And we do this using an estimate of the value of carbon payments that have been made in Indonesia for previous carbon storage projects. And on the next slide, I'm going to go into what some of our assumptions were for this. So historically, Indonesia has been very active in carbon financing programs, such as the Reducing Emissions and Deforestation and Forest Degradation Program, or REDD+. And so what this means is that we can actually look at how much has been paid for carbon sequestration in Indonesia in the past. And there's a range of values that have been used. We use a low estimate just to sort of be a little bit conservative in this project. So specifically, we use a value of $3.3 per ton of carbon dioxide. And this is a very low estimate. This is from several years ago. And we use that low estimate so that we can show that even with a conservative value for the cost of carbon, this project is still economically viable. Using this price for carbon, we see that our total value of 9.69 million tons of carbon dioxide avoided, multiplied by the $3.3 per ton, we get a total value of about $32 million. But many of these programs, such as REDD+, are results-based. And so what that means is that these payments would not be granted until it's been demonstrated that the project is actually successful. So we assume that these carbon payments will start 6 years after the reforestation begins, and that they're spread over 4 years. And just to show what that would look like, so here we assume the project started in 2021, then we're saying that carbon payments will start in 2026, and be spread out over those 4 years. So with a total payment of $32 million spread over 4 years, we get that $8 million will be paid each year from 2026 through 2020. And so here, just to summarize, we started with our land cover maps. We could then calculate how much carbon was stored in that land cover using the INVEST models. From this, we could calculate the change in carbon storage due to the project. And then using this idea of carbon markets, we could actually value that carbon storage. So just to summarize again, the key takeaways from this assessment. First, we see that this project has positive net benefits for society. We also estimated the cost to build a reservoir with similar water retention capacity. And what we found was that the NBI was less expensive, suggesting that this is a more cost-effective way to improve water management in this area. We also saw that this project contributes to climate adaptation, specifically by avoiding flood and erosion damages, as well as by improving water availability. And thinking a little bit more about those avoided damages, we see that the project creates a lot of value by avoiding flooding, erosion, and water pollution. But one of the challenges is that these types of avoided costs are not monetized for investors. And this is a challenge that we see very frequently with nature-based infrastructure, which is that these interventions create huge amount of value, but not necessarily in the form of money that is being paid back to investors. And so this makes it very hard for private investors to actually be able to put money into these projects. But what we did find is that the carbon payments can cover the investment and maintenance costs. So if carbon payments could be made available for this project, that might be one viable option for how to finance this type of reforestation and water management project, and ultimately how to scale these types of projects to a larger level. And so with that, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Rania to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you so much, Emma, for that presentation. I found it really useful how you had that step-by-step kind of pathway, how you model the different indicators. Really useful. So now that we heard about the modeling side of things, I really look forward to hearing some of the practical insights, how results like this can be used by project stakeholders. So I'm very pleased that we have Christian Susan today with us here from the United Nations Industrial Development Organizations. And he will be able to tell us a little bit about what their role was in this project in Indonesia and how they used the results there. So warm welcome, Christian, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, good morning, wherever you might be to everybody. I work with, as I already announced, with the United Nations Industrial Development Organization in the division of circular economy and resource efficiency. And as the UN specialized organization with the mandate to promote inclusive and sustainable industrial development, we have a little bit of a comparative edge when it comes to direct cooperation with private sector entities. So a couple of years ago, we've been approached by Heineken. They wanted to cooperate with us on their water stewardship approaches and their water stewardship program. And for Heineken, this meant that they had identified amongst their 180 plus production sites, which of them are located in a water-stressed catchment area, where is water scarcity an issue. For the most affected ones, they have then organized, they said, well, we want to first of all, become we want to become water use effective, but that's our own homework. So we reduce the amount of water we need per liter product. But they also realized that, think about, we always use the example, if you have a bowl of water and there are 20 people sucking with a big straw, the level of the water will go down. It doesn't make a big difference. Is it only one person who sucks less? And Heineken said, well, we will go a step further. We will also balance our own water consumption, but the overall target is to reduce water stress to mitigate water scarcity in the catchment area. So they said, we need to reach out to other stakeholders. And these are stakeholders from government who dwell in the same catchment area, so have a regulatory function. These are other industries, these are NGOs, and this is also the academia which works in the catchment area. So it's always catchment area specific, because they all have an interest and they all suffer from too much water during the rainy season and too little water during the dry season. And everywhere in the world, when you reach water scarcity levels, industry is the first one to feel that there is not enough water, because government doesn't turn off the water supply to people, and it's right so not to turn it off. And they don't reduce the water supply to agriculture, regardless how much water agriculture uses, regardless how much water is used for municipal purposes. So the industries had a very strong role. We brought together the stakeholders. We came out, the stakeholders have identified what they would think to be the best option for collaborative efforts to mitigate water scarcity. And these were the measures already presented. This was the agroforestry schemes, the bamboo forests, and the absorption wells, and the smaller version of the absorption wells, which is very good to be used when you want to have a politician to sink one of these biopori, because this biopori you do with a hand drill, ideal to bring any decision maker, any politician to a school, and they do it together with the kids. And you can explain then what is the function of such an absorption well, because the water goes back to the ground rather than run off from the surface. So the task at hand then was, Heineken said, we are committed to balance our own water consumption. We want to offset this, or PT Multibintang, the Heineken Indonesian operating company. But I think, as you can imagine, for private sector entity, they're driven by costs. So they say we have a commitment, we want to balance our own water consumption, but we want to do it in the most cost-effective way. So shall we do it by agroforestry schemes, or shall we do it by small dams or check dams? And so this study could really inform the private sector people who have a very high commitment to contribute to mitigate water stewardship, that going the route of agroforestry schemes, bamboo forests, and these absorption wells is more cost effective than retaining the same quantity of water by any technical hardcore infrastructure. So this was one of the elements to inform decision-making from the private sector perspective. The next step was, we have pledged in this partnership that once Heineken fulfills its own commitments, we would come in to develop an upscaling project to really make sure that all these other stakeholders which were engaged in the stakeholder process to identify the options can also play their role. And we know when it comes to this, government quite often has very high intentions, but their coffers are not full. So we approached the Global Environment Facility and we said, well, we have this private sector partnership and we have the interest of government to support an upscaling project. So we sought, Jeff has two kinds of projects. So we sought the support for medium-sized projects with a budget of $2 million. And again, we could then use this study to demonstrate to the Global Environment Facility not only that it makes financial sense, so that the costs to achieve the best possible upscaling are the lowest with the solutions proposed, but also that there is a lot of positive externalities which are being provided by these nature-based infrastructure solutions. And as it was mentioned, the problem is these externalities, normally this is something no one pays for it, but society at large has to cover the costs of negative externalities. And the problem is always where you have positive externalities and the decision maker is not being paid for them. Well, I think it's quite clear that too little of them is being provided, and we have negative externalities, too much is being provided. And as an example, I always use, if you have a field of land, you have 1 hectare of land, and you can either have intensive agriculture, so you pay for the factor inputs into your production process, the seedlings, the weeding, the fertilizer, and then you have 2 or 3 harvests per year, depending on your climate. And then you can do a financial cost benefit analysis. How much did you have to pay for the inputs? How much can you get per kilo tomato, per kilo cucumber, whatever. In the same time, intensive agriculture can cause negative externalities. You can overexploit the groundwater. You can cause pesticides to reach the groundwater body, which then cause downstream some health issues with the people. And you can cause erosion on the piece of land. So these are negative externalities, but in your decision-making process, private sector people don't take this into consideration. They see how much you have to pay and how much you get out of it. In parallel, you could have you could establish a forest, and then the same thing. You need to buy the seedlings, you need to have the silviculture measures, you need to harvest the wood, and then you can sell the timber. And then so many cubic meters of timber is so much worse. So then if you look at it, that these forests also provide positive externalities. So they provide habitat for bees, which fertilize the neighboring lands. As we hear, the forest sequester carbon, but the owner of the forest normally doesn't get a prime for the sequestering of the carbon. The forests can control erosion. They can retain the water in the catchment area. So all these things, if you look at decisions from a government perspective, which really looks at has to look at it not only from a financial, but from an economic perspective, because in the end of the day, these damages accrue or these benefits are missing somewhere. This is what helps them to inform the decision-making process. And I think this MEVA4 project and the study we did together with IISD was really the ideal tool to, on one hand, inform an investment decision by a private sector entity to say, well, we have a task at hand. We need to retain X million cubic meters of water per year. Is the solution which has been identified really more cost effective than a hardcore technical infrastructure solution? And then in addition to demonstrate, it does not only make business sense, it also makes economical sense to go this route. And this has allowed us then to mobilize this $2 million from the Global Environment Facility for the upscaling project. And we are in the middle of implementation with the Ministry of Environment and Forestry as our partner. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, because I think I just spun through it as fast as possible for the benefit of time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Christian. Very, very interesting, your perspective on this and kind of your view on how these integrated assessments can really help to inform investment decisions, can showcase people the added benefits they can get from such projects. So
just allow me to add, and we will use this study also to mobilize, because now also the ministry is fully on board, to see whether, because again, what we can do is a few hundred hectares of forest with 2 million. The big money is not with the Global Environment Facility. The big money in the donor community is nowadays with the Green Climate Fund. And Indonesia has the same problems, that upstream forests are being deforested, which has a serious impact on the water supply, water security of downstream settlements. So we are using this now, this upscaling project, to really go further together with the Ministry of Environment and Forestry into the direction of a larger scale, and larger scale in GCF terms means $80 to $100 million project, where this can be scaled up throughout Java and onto other islands in Indonesia.
Thank you. Really impressive. I would like to turn to some of the questions from the chat now. So Emma, I see you already kind of responding to some of the questions. Would you maybe like to pick up the question from Martin about how we included lost benefits because maybe agriculture was turned into forest. So how did we account for kind of land use changes in the cost benefit analysis?
Yeah, and that's a really great question, and always something that we want to consider, that if we're getting rid of agricultural land, that could be a negative impact. However, as Christiane was just kind of elaborating on, this project really focused on agroforestry. And so that agricultural land that was converted into forest was still very productive. And in fact, we might expect it to be more productive, as agroforestry systems often are able to actually produce more value per hectare than conventional agriculture. So in this case, we actually would not expect to see that decrease in production.
Wonderful, thank you. So if anyone else has questions, please put it in the chat. I see a question, well, from a participant where we don't have a specific name. How did you deal specifically with land ownership for the areas that were used for this project? Various ministries in Indonesia are involved in providing concessions for land use and most lean towards industrial use of land. This is something we struggle with at Invest International, where we try to finance large-scale infrastructure projects with the green MES element. So yeah, how do we deal with land ownership for implementing NBI? Any thoughts on that, Emma?
So for our assessment, that's not something that we're looking at explicitly. We're really focused on showing the value of this project, and then hoping that kind of other project proponents can take this information and sort of get more into the sort of details of how can we actually implement it, knowing that this project does create so much value. So we're really just sort of providing one piece of the puzzle that is important for that project preparation. And
I might
go ahead.
Add up, yes. So we initially already targeted restoration of agroforestry schemes on degraded land. So, and this is state-owned land, which has been encroached by people, it's the fringe zone. So there is still some residual forest left on the top of these mountains in Indonesia. But over the years, agriculture has been moving up higher and closer. And then you end up, since it's a land with a very steep gradient, there is quite a lot of problems with erosion and land degradation. So this land is not the most fertile land, and it's government-owned land. And this is then the benefit of having partners in government, which sometimes can be difficult in Indonesia. I worked there for 2 years, I lived there for 2 years, so I still know a little bit of the language also. But in this case, the partnership with the Ministry of Environment and Forest was extremely fruitful. And also the study helped us to convince them that this project makes sense, not only from the water side to address the issues of floods and water scarcity during the dry season, but then also to say it's a cost-effective way, it's a way which can be upscaled. And the best thing is, yes, we initially wanted to have a different executing agency. Jeff, you're always in the project implementing and the project executing agency. We thought about an international NGO, but I think in retrospect, the choice of the Ministry of Environment and Forestry was the right one, because they can address these issues. They know exactly where you have this degraded land. They know which land can be accessed, and they also have the outreach services to have access to the land. Does this answer your question of our unknown participant?
Yes, I think so. And we also found out that it was Laura asking the question.
Okay.
Thanks for that. I don't see another pressing question in the chat right now, but out of my own curiosity, Emma, I know that we use different climate scenarios for all our assessment of nature-based infrastructure, and sometimes the results are strikingly different depending on what climate scenario we look at. So can you maybe share a little bit on that aspect of the assessment?
Yeah, so what we found, and what's often the case, is that as the expected climate damages get worse, the project avoided costs get larger. So if there's the possibility for more flooding, then avoiding that flooding is more valuable. So that's kind of the broad overview. One thing that was interesting actually about these two climate scenarios is that, maybe I can actually go back to that slide. I can pull it up. But what we found was that there were kind of differences based on the time scale that we looked at. So here, there's.
And maybe.
So what we see looking at these two different climate scenarios, if we looked at this assessment first, just considering kind of the shorter terms, we went out for about 20 years. And if we go out to the year, say 2040, we see that under this higher climate change scenario, RCP 8.5, there's a lot more flooding events, over this sort of threshold that we identified as being sort of a lot of precipitation. But if we look out farther in time, so if we go all the way out to say 2050, then we see that under this lower climate change scenario, there's this one incredibly extreme event. And the important thing to remember about these climate projections is that we're not actually using averages or best guesses. We're using one single model run that basically is saying, this is a plausible trajectory for precipitation given the assumptions behind the RCP 4.5 climate scenario. So it doesn't necessarily mean that with less greenhouse gas emissions, there will be this one huge flood event, but it means that it's possible even under our lower climate change scenario. And so what this shows is that the sort of climate projections and our results under these different climate scenarios really depend on these extreme events and whether or not they come to pass, as well as the frequency with which the flooding occurs.
Thanks, Emma. Very useful. We have two more questions in the chat, if you don't mind. So Raman is asking whether we've actually conducted this analysis kind of before project implementation, and then whether we've actually also checked after implementations how the results might have changed. So I know that we usually don't do the kind of ex post evaluation after the project is completely done, even though we look at projects at different implementation stages. But maybe, Emma, you can talk a little bit about the kind of sensitivity analysis and kind of how robust the results are that we see in our cost-benefit analyses.
Yeah, so as Anya mentioned, we did not, compare to the, after implementation. And part of the reason for that is just that implementation takes a long time, and then there's going to have to be a lot of monitoring that would go on for years after the implementation to actually compare to the results of our model. So, there is sort of uncertainty around our results. But again, what we're really trying to show is there's a holistic value. And in this case, we can highlight what some of those most important values are. So we can say, we know that carbon storage will increase, and we can say that with pretty good confidence. And then we're able to put this, very conservative estimate for the value of that carbon storage. So in that case, we might expect that actually the value would be much larger. Again, we can use these spatial models to show that, the water retention will increase. And there's a lot of uncertainty around what the actual value would be. But we're able to start putting some quantitative analysis into actually how much water is retained, how much water is not going towards flooding, and it's instead becoming groundwater.
Wonderful. Thank you, Emma. And maybe you can say very shortly something about how local communities are involved in projects like these. We've seen the cost-benefit analyses that there's this job creation from the interventions, but maybe you can talk a little bit about the stakeholder engagement here. Or Christian as well, if you want to say something there. We're close to the hour already, so I would keep it short, but over to you.
Well, in the planning process, local communities were engaged through community-based organizations, which are quite strong in Indonesia and particularly strong in the area. So there were already quite some present. And in the implementation, the Ministry of Environment and Forestry has a special implementation scheme where they involve local communities to do the work. So they're being basically paid as laborers. So it's not only the benefit later on. And the idea behind this, it's not only to establish agroforestry schemes and bamboo forests, but also to have some added value processes so that it makes more sense for the communities. Agroforestry is chosen because the benefit from keeping the trees alive is higher than from what you can get from timber sales. And then if you have some support for the marketing of the non-forest timber products, this is when you come onto the winning street, because then it makes also, in the end of the day, the farmer is also a person which has to survive. And if he gets more money out of selling the timber, chopping down the trees, he would do it. But if he gets more money, not only in the long term, but already in the short term, of keeping these trees alive, harvesting the fruits, and selling these non-timber forest products, this makes sense for them to do it. Same thing for bamboo. The nice thing about bamboo is it grows fast. You chop it down, it grows again from the bamboo stool. So it is, even if you might lose some of the stems, they grow back. And we also then have some support to the community-based organizations, through community-based organizations, for the marketing of value-added process which are based on bamboo. And communities are then also being involved in the actual restoration process. So that's done. The Ministry of Environment and Forest is quite well advanced in Indonesia, and they have their particular patterns how they can involve and engage communities in such processes.
Thank you, Christian. So I think with that, we've pretty much come to the end of the webinar. I would just close with some kind of practicalities and the way forward. Yeah, Emma, if you can share that in presentation mode, if possible, that would be great. Because as part of our nature-based infrastructure global resource center, we might be able to offer such an assessment as you've just seen in this webinar to you as well. So we have funding to provide these assessments to you if you have a nature-based infrastructure project, an infrastructure project that is located in a developing country and contributes to climate adaptation. Then we might be able to help you with such an integrated cost-benefit analysis and really work closely with you on such an assessment. So if you're interested in that, you can find more information on the website, or you can also just reach out to us directly. We're very happy to talk about that. And then on the next slide, I just wanted to repeat that we have this training course about nature-based infrastructure. So all 5 course modules are available on the website, and you can just study them at your own pace. But we also offer interactive online sessions. Probably the next round of these webinars will take place in the autumn this year. And it's free to register for that. So if you want to learn more about NBI, you can learn there. And we have a new LinkedIn group for the Nature-Based Infrastructure Global Resource Center, where you can receive regular news and events and reports and all the publications about NBI. So I would also invite you to follow the LinkedIn group. And with that, just the feedback survey, please. So as I mentioned before, this webinar series is already based on feedback we have received before, because so many people were asking for more case studies on the methodologies. So we really take your feedback very seriously and would appreciate if you could fill out this brief survey about the webinar today. And with that, I would just like to thank you all for joining today. A big thank you to Emma for the presentation and for Christian for all the reflections today, and also for all the ISD colleagues, Georg, Betty, and Eduardo for helping here today. Thank you all for joining, and we hope to see you again very soon.